So welcome to this presentation on the Vancouver Island Pest, Pollinators, and Beneficials Project, or VIPPB for short. My name is Bonnie Zand, and I run a small integrated pest management consulting company where I help farmers to monitor and manage their pest insects. And I also work with various other groups to survey and enhance native pollinators and other positive species. And so I'm really excited to be working on this project where we kind of bring agriculture and pests and pollinators and all of these different things together, and where we're going to be working to try and document some of the diversity of different species that show up in our agricultural systems here on Vancouver Island. I'm presenting to you today from the Comox Valley, which is in the traditional territory of the Coast Salish people and the Comox Nation. And those people have a long history of agriculture and of relationships with our native beneficial species here that predate colonization. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. I would encourage you all to write in the chat and let me know who you are, where you're from, and what your relationships to agriculture and to beneficial insect species are. I'm interested to see what sort of a diverse group we've got here. I think we've got some farmers and probably some naturalists and a bunch of other people. So I'm interested to know more about you. The project that I'm going to be presenting to you today has been funded by the governments of Canada and British Columbia under the Canadian Agricultural Partnership. And the funding has been administered by the Investment Agricultural Foundation in BC and the BC Agricultural Research and Development Corporation. And the project is part of the Regional Adaptation Program delivered by Climate and Agriculture Initiative BC. So while I'm talking about agriculture and pests and beneficial species, one of the driving forces behind this project is also climate change and how climate interacts with all of those things in agricultural systems. So an overview of what's going to be happening on my talk today. So we're going to start with talking about what are agricultural pest, pollinators, and beneficials. Going to move into what sort of factors impact agricultural pests, pollinators, and beneficial insects. We're going to talk about how is this project, VIPPB, responding to those factors? And then how can you help? And also, how can this project help you? And then I'm going to explain how do you use iNaturalist, which is the citizen science program that we are using to run this part of the project. So let's start with what are agricultural pest, pollinators, and beneficials? So pests, I think most of us have a pretty clear understanding of what we mean by pests. So these are species that do things that negatively impact what we as people want to see happening. And in agricultural systems, we're pretty frequently looking at things that are herbivores or feeders on plants. So I've got a photo here of a crucifer flea beetle. So this little beetle is feeding on a broccoli and putting holes in it and making it not look pretty so people don't want to eat it. And if there are enough of these feeding, they can stunt that plant and cause it to die. And so that's one type of pest. We also have different types of pests that attack the roots of plants. We have pests that attack fruits and berries. And we also have pests that do things like transmit diseases, or pests that suck sap out of plants and weaken them. And so there are many different kinds of agricultural pests, and we are always in agriculture trying to find better ways to manage them and to mitigate their negative impacts on the food that we are trying to grow. Also in the pest category are diseases, and those can be fungal, bacterial, or viral. And this project isn't specifically focused on diseases, but there are interactions between diseases and pest insects. As I said, some pests can transmit diseases between plants. And so when you're out there helping me to document what's going on in our agricultural systems. You may sometimes also be documenting some diseases, and that's great. That's fine too. You'll also find that sometimes it can be really hard to differentiate between a disease and a pest insect, because symptoms can be similar. And so I'm sure we are going to get some observations of diseases while we're out there seeing what else is out there. And that's great. Beneficial insects are a bit of a broader category than pests. And there's a lot of different kinds of beneficial insects, and they do different things. And often in our agricultural systems, we don't think about our beneficials nearly as much as we think about our pests. We tend to be really focused on whatever is killing our plants and not nearly as focused on the things that are helping our plants and keeping them healthy. So I've got a few different categories of beneficial insects here. So pollinators is one that people do think about, especially nowadays, and especially if you're a grower of a crop that requires pollination. And so there's a lot of statistics out there suggesting that things such as 1 out of every 3 bites of food come from a crop that requires pollination. And so pollination is incredibly important for us all to be able to eat. And especially, right now I've got a lot of pollinating going on in my raspberries, and I'm really excited to see that, because I know without that pollination, there won't be delicious berries. And here I have a pollinator. So this is a bumblebee, which is a native pollinator. When we think about pollinators, the ones that come to mind first tend to be honeybees, because those are very common, and those are a managed species. But I also want you to know that there are many, many other pollinators besides honeybees. So we have bumblebees and many other types of native bees. There's about 500 different kinds of native bees in BC. So that's a huge array of pollinators that we need to be thinking about and documenting and finding out which of those are interacting in our agricultural systems. And then besides bees, flies can be pollinators, beetles can be pollinators, wasps can be pollinators, moths can be pollinators. There's a huge diversity of different types of pollinators. And so I really want this project to help us to expand beyond just thinking honeybees, thinking about all the other kinds of pollinators that are very important. Another category of beneficial is predators. And so these are species that eat pests. And so I've got here for you a lady beetle, which is one of the beneficial predators that we tend to think of. It's a commonly known one. And lady beetles are wonderful to have in our farms, in our gardens. They do a lot of pest control. And that's very helpful. Where the lady beetles are doing the pest control, we don't have to do it. But just like with bees, there are many, many other types of predators in our agricultural systems beyond lady beetles. So we have things like hoverflies, we have things like lacewings, we have predatory ground beetles, and so a wide diversity of species that prey on different types of pests on the ground, on the plants. We also have aerial predators, things like dragonflies and damselflies that we don't really think about a lot as occurring in our agricultural systems and being part of pest control, but they also can be important. And then, although this project is sort of focusing and talking a lot about insects, I also want to say that there's a lot of beneficial insects that, there are a lot of beneficials that are not insects. So for example, spiders can be quite important predators. Parasitoids is another category of beneficial. And these are ones that really most people are pretty unaware of. So parasitoids are species that undergo their development within a host species. And so I've got an example here of one type of parasitoid. So this, what you're seeing, is an aphid. But this aphid has had an egg laid in it by a parasitoid wasp, which is much different than the hornets or yellow jackets you're used to thinking about as wasps. They're actually tiny, 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 tiny wasps. We rarely notice, but they'll lay their eggs inside of aphids, and their larvae will undergo development inside this aphid and essentially eat it from the inside out and devour all of what's inside of it. And then once it's finished its development, it cuts a little hatch in the butt of this aphid and the flap pops open and out comes this new little tiny parasitoid wasp that's then flying off in search of more insect prey. And so even though we don't see these particular beneficial insects that often, we can sometimes see what they've left behind. So we can see these aphids that have been parasitized. And these types of wasps, and they can also be flies, are also very important in control of things like caterpillars. And again, it's often this sort of pest control that we really don't notice until it's gone, until something happens and we lose that pest control and all of a sudden our pest populations are out of control. But as long as it's happening, don't even notice it. Another category of beneficial would be soil builders. And so I have a millipede here. So these are the species that break down dead and decaying organic matter and return it to the soil and release those nutrients for other species and plants to use. And so they're also very essential to our agriculture. If we didn't have these decomposers and soil builders, we would have a lot of problems. And many of these are microscopic. And so we won't necessarily be seeing them, but there are some that are large enough that we can observe them. And so I've got this little millipede here. So those are kind of a very broad overview of some of the categories. Excuse me. So this is a broad overview of some of the categories of pests, pollinators, and beneficials that we are interested in and that we want to learn more about, where these species occur, how these species occur in Vancouver Island agriculture. So that's the species. The next question is, what is agriculture? And specifically in the realm of this project, how are we defining agriculture? And we're taking a pretty broad view of it. So when you're out there helping us to document the diversity of species in Vancouver Island agriculture, I'm interested in observations from anything from a home garden. Here I've got my little garden beds, not exactly large scale production, but that's okay. Observations from that scale are fine. And we're interested in observations right up until large scale farms. So big monocrop operations that are producing a lot of food. We also want to know what sort of species are present there. We're interested in a diversity of growing styles, from certified organic to permaculture to biodynamic to natural to conventional. We want to know what sort of beneficial species and pest species show up in all of those scales. And we're also interested in observations that are not actually in crops themselves. So I'm interested in knowing what sort of beneficial species are in the farm margins and in non-agricultural areas. And the reason for that is that many of our both pest and beneficial species don't spend their entire lives just in crops. So a lot of them have one or more stages of their life that are spent outside of crops. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about life cycles of beneficial species and pest species in a minute. But it's important to think when we're thinking about our species in agriculture about what surrounds our agricultural systems, because those things can have a really big impact on what we find in our agricultural systems. And so just for example, if we're thinking about pollinators, most of our pollinator species need a place to nest. And those nests are very rarely inside agricultural systems where they're intensively managed. And instead they need surrounding areas that they can use for nesting sites and then fly from those into our crops to pollinate. And so we're interested in observations of these agricultural species in all the areas where they occur. And as another example of this, I've got a photo here So I took this today. I was picking my daughter up from preschool, and the preschool has some garden beds that I don't think we can really define as agricultural in any way. It looks like they've managed to produce one edible radish out of the entire preschool garden beds. But instead, these are play spaces and spots where the children are interacting and learning. But in these garden beds, they did have a big bush of sage that was in bloom. And all over the sage were these lady beetles. And I was talking to the preschool teacher, and she was telling me that every year this sage bush is full of lady beetles. And so even though the sage itself, in this case, isn't being used as an agricultural crop, that's a sort of observation that I'm really interested in us collecting. Because if I, as a grower, would like to have more lady beetles near my crops, eating aphids, controlling my pests, then I can think, ooh, perhaps sage might be a thing I would like to plant near my farm and bring that in as a species that encourages beneficial insects. And we can also think about non-crop crop hosts that encourage pest insects. And so, for example, I would point out to you that Himalayan blackberry is a species that can create really large populations of a pest called the spotted-winged Drosophila. Spotted-winged Drosophila just loves Himalayan blackberry, and the populations will build to very high levels in Himalayan blackberry, and from there will spill over into crop fields. And so it's really important when we're thinking about insects in agricultural and beneficial species in agriculture that we think outside the boundaries of just our crops. Think about what else is out there and how is it impacting the species that we see. So that's what agriculture is. That's what the species we're interested in. And then the question that we're kind of asking is, what sort of factors impact agricultural pests, pollinators, and beneficials? What are the things we need to be thinking about and being concerned about these really important species that have such a large role in agriculture? And there's a few different ways we can think about this. And we can think about large scale factors that can impact these species. And so one of these, as I mentioned before, is climate change. That's why this project is under Climate and Agriculture BC. As the climate changes, we're expecting to see changes in pest pressures and also changes in our beneficial species and our pollinators. And I told you I was going to talk a little bit about life cycles. So I've got here, this is a generalized insect life cycle. And I do just want to say that not all insects have this specific life cycle, but quite a few of them do. Insects are very diverse and they do a lot of different things. I can't explain everything all in this webinar. But a generalized life cycle would start with eggs. Eggs that hatch into a larva, or in the case of this particular example, if that larva would be called a caterpillar. This stage feeds and grows and develops until it's reached a sufficient size that it is time for it to go into its pupal stage. And so in the case of a caterpillar, this would be spinning a cocoon. And that's the resting stage where the insect really reorganizes its entire body. And it emerges as an adult. The adult can be really, really, really different from the larva. So it can feed on different foods. It can live in different habitats. In this case, we have an adult that can fly, whereas the larvae are not able to fly. And the adult lays the eggs, which starts the cycle happening again. And this whole cycle, in the case of insects, if you remember back from elementary school, we all learned that insects are ectothermic or cold-blooded. And that means that they don't control their own temperature. Instead, it's controlled by external factors, the environment around them. And so when it is very cold, insects are not able to warm themselves up and they're not able to develop. And so in a cool or cold time of year, they really just stay at a stable state. But once the temperature warms up, then they're able to take in that heat and use it to power themselves, just to eat, to feed, to grow, to develop. And as the temperature gets warmer, they go through all of the stages of their lives faster. So in warmer temperatures, eggs take longer to hatch. Sorry, eggs hatch quicker, take less time to hatch. Caterpillars are able to be more active, they feed more, they grow more quickly. They spend less time in their cocoon, and they emerge as adults earlier, and the adults are able to reach reproductive maturity more quickly. And so one of the things that may happen with climate change is that this generalized life cycle for each species may just almost like it's been put on fast forward a little bit. It'll just speed up. And so depending on the species, some types of insects may only go through this cycle one time over a year. Other species, and especially some pest species, will go through this cycle many times over a season. And every time they go around the cycle, the population gets a little bit bigger. And so one concern with climate change is that as we have slightly warmer temperatures and this cycle speeds up, we could have pest insects that are able to increase in numbers more quickly. They're just going to go through the whole cycle faster and faster and produce more and more offspring that will do more and more damage to crops. We're also concerned with climate change that as our summer season gets longer, again, we're providing more time for this life cycle to happen. And so these pest insects can, again, have more time to reproduce and to grow. Winter for insects is often kind of like hitting the reset button. When it's cold, many of these insects die. And so when we have a long, cold, hard winter, it really knocks a lot of our pest insect populations back down to low levels. And then in the spring, they have to start out building up again. With climate change, if we have winters that, rather than being long and cold, are kind of short and mild, then what we're looking at seeing is having a lot more pests show up in the spring. You know, they've survived the winter and they're ready to get going. And so these are all things that we're concerned about that might be changing the populations of some of these pest species. And of course, they'll be doing the same thing to our beneficial species as well. But how will the balance end up? Will the pest species benefit more from climate change, or will the beneficial species benefit more? This is a question we don't know the answer to yet. And of course, the climate change questions are also impacted by other things. So for example, introduced species. There's a lot of introduced species out there, and many of our agricultural pests are species that were introduced from somewhere else. And this continues to happen. So for example, about 10 years ago, spotted wing Drosophila, which is a very serious agricultural pest, which originates in Asia, was accidentally introduced. And since then, it's spread all through our region and has had major impacts on agriculture here. And growers have had to change their practices in order to manage it. We also have species that are introduced intentionally. So for example, in the Fraser Valley, a lot of eastern bumblebees are sometimes brought in for pollination in greenhouses. And those bumblebees don't naturally occur here, but some of them have escaped from cultivation and have established populations. And so now we have a new species that didn't used to be here. And so we have questions, how will it interact with our species of bumblebees that are naturally here? Is it just gonna fit in with them nicely, or will it perhaps outcompete them and replace them? And of course, anytime there's an introduced species, we also have questions about introduced pests and diseases that might negatively impact the species that we already have. And so all of these factors are happening at a large scale, and we'd really like to know, like, how are these things impacting the species that we rely on here in Vancouver Island agriculture? And of course, as well as that large scale, there's also all sorts of local scale factors that can impact the species that are on any particular farm. And so these are things like how many nesting sites are available? Are there alternate food resources? So just as I said that in this particular life cycle, the larva can feed on something different than the adult. For a lot of beneficial species, we have a larval stage that is predatory, and it feeds on aphids or mites or other pests. But we have an adult stage that's actually a pollinator, and so it needs flowers. And so how many of this beneficial species are present on any given farm may have something to do with the flower resources that are available. Overwintering sites are important for these species. They need places to find shelter and to be safe. And refuges. If we have an intensively managed area or an area where pesticides are applied, those management activities, tillage, harvesting, applying pesticides can kill and remove all of the beneficial insects from that particular area. And so are there areas surrounding the farm where those species are safe and protected and they can recolonize the crop areas and continue to provide those important services? So all of these different factors that impact agriculture and agricultural species leave us with a bunch of possible scenarios of what might happen to any one particular species. So it's possible that some species could increase in number given climate change and new introductions. If those are pest species that are increasing, that's a problem. We might have species that decrease in number. And if the species that aren't doing as well are beneficial species, then again, we have a problem. And of course, new species can arrive. So I have here the Asian giant hornet. So that's a new species that has been detected on Vancouver Island. Looks like they hopefully eradicated it, but that's something we're always wanting to be keeping an eye out for something new to show up. Current species can also disappear. This is the western bumblebee, Bombus occidentalis, which used to be a very common and very important agricultural pollinator, but whose population has dropped drastically and who now we very rarely see. And so all of these things might happen to our pests, to our pollinators, to our beneficial insects. And we really want to know what's going on so that we can try and, if it's a new introduced species, try and mitigate that, try and get rid of it. If it's a species that's currently important and its population is declining, we want to take action to try and enhance that population and protect it. But the biggest issue that we run into for all of these things is a lack of baseline data. In order to know whether a species is doing well or poorly, we need to know what normal is. In order to know whether a pest is becoming a bigger problem, we need to know how big a problem it normally is. And even in order to know whether or not a species that started to cause us issues is new, we really need to know what was all here originally. Is that species a new introduction? Or is it just a species that's always been here? And for some reason, maybe with warmer summers or milder winters, it's suddenly become a problem. And baseline data is really lacking, especially here on Vancouver Island. We've got a high diversity of agriculture, but we're not nearly as intensive as in other regions like the Fraser Valley, where more work has been done to try to document what are the pollinators in agricultural systems, what are the beneficial insects. And so we're really asking that question here. What do we even have? What are the species that we need to be protecting? What are species that could become issues? And we don't know. And we have a lack of time and funding to get that information because collecting baseline data takes a lot of work, a lot of time, and sometimes a lot of expertise to have people look at everything that's been collected and try and figure out what it is. And so that's kind of the reason that this project started, the Vancouver Island Pest Pollinators and Beneficials project. And so we're responding to this issue that We have lots of species that are important to agriculture. With climate change and other impacts, those species populations could be changing, and we don't really know how they're changing, so we don't know how to respond. And so we are trying to respond to that problem. And there's a couple different ways that we're doing it. So the first avenue that we are using is for the pests. And so this is specifically for farmers. And what we are doing is we are going onto farms and we're monitoring for pests and watching for things, seeing how populations are changing over time. And we're providing that information to growers through a grower newsletter. And so this is just to keep all the farmers up to date on what's going on with the pests. Is there anything new happening? If stuff starts showing up earlier than usual or later than usual, we want growers to know. We're also providing on-farm training in integrated pest management. And so we're going to be running some workshops over the summer where we're going to be going onto farms and training farmers in how to do their own monitoring. So they can also be watching and seeing what are their pest populations doing? Are things changing? And we're going to be, while we do that, we're going to be collecting and distributing this data on pest levels. Keep all the growers up to date so nobody is surprised by a sudden pest surgence. And I'm going to put some links in the chat. I've already put them at the top, but I'll put them in again at the end so that you can sign up to get our grower newsletter. You can sign up if you're a farmer to join an on-farm training and learn how to do your own monitoring. But those things are all really focused primarily around pests. And even there, we're a little bit limited. We can only do so many pests and only do it in so many crops. But there's so much more to species in Vancouver Island agriculture. And so that's where this part of the project comes in. So this is the citizen science part of the project, where we're trying to learn about those beneficials and about those pollinators and what's happening with them. And so citizen science takes this view that you don't have to be an expert, you don't have to be a farmer, you don't have to be a biologist, you don't have to be an agrologist, you don't have to have specialized training at all in order to be able to contribute meaningful data that can help us learn what's happening in our environment. And in the case of this project, the citizen science platform that we're going to be using is called iNaturalist. And in order to use iNaturalist, no special training. You need a camera or a smartphone, and you need a computer. And you need to be willing to get out there and look at things and observe, look at little insects and bugs and cool stuff like that. So there we go. What is iNaturalist? So iNaturalist is a citizen science platform where it takes photos taken by individuals, and those photos need to be matched with a location and a date. And it puts those photos up into this kind of amazing database that anyone can look at and try and see what other people are observing. And I've got a little video here that just sort of explains and shows how to use iNaturalist. So I'm going to play this, hopefully. Thinking. Okay, here we go. Oh, is the video not playing?
No video.
No. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, hang on. Sorry, I just watched the whole thing. I thought you were watching. Let me reshare my screen with a different one then. Thank you for telling me. Here we go. Restart. Okay, can we see it now?
Yes, it's showing now.
Excellent.
Yep.
No sound though.
Hang on. Is there no sound?
I'm not hearing anything.
You have to press sound, share sound before you press share screen.
All right. I guess I should have tested this video out. Let me just try this one more time. And then if it doesn't work, I will just explain it to you. All right, so share screen. Let's see. Share, oh, I see it. Share computer sound. Okay. All right. Luckily, it's a short video. Here we go again. Can you hear it?
Okay, so you've installed the iNaturalist app and created an account. Time to get outside and record your first observation. Here's how to do it.
Can someone just confirm for me that you can hear it?
Yes, we can hear it.
Perfect, thank you.
Any living thing, like a plant, animal, or fungus, can be an observation on iNaturalist. Once you find something you'd like to record, just tap Observe and take a photo. You can review your picture, then hit Next if it looks good. To identify it, hit What did you see? If you have an internet connection, iNaturalist will suggest 10 visually similar species and often a common ancestor. You can choose one of those or search for a species name. On this observation details screen, you can add more photos of the same organism or write a note. The date, time, and location have been automatically added. You can also change the geoprivacy of the observation, mark whether it's captive or cultivated, or add it to a project. Once you're finished, just hit share and your observation will be uploaded for everyone to see and identify. That's it. Keep on exploring and sharing.
Okay, so that was a brief introduction to iNaturalist. So as you can see, you go out, you take photos, and then you upload them. And so I'm going to show you our iNaturalist project, which is right here. There we go. So I hope that you've all checked out the iNaturalist platform and maybe made yourselves an iNaturalist account. If not, it's free. It's pretty simple. There's a desktop version, and there is also a version for on your smartphone. You can use either. Once you've made yourself an iNaturalist account, then what you do is you find our project. And again, I'll put the link back into the chat. It should be up at the top. But if it wasn't, I will add it there again. And once you find our project, you can, this link right here on mine, it says edit project. On yours, it will say join project. So you can click join project, and then you are part of this specific project on iNaturalist. So everything that you put up goes on all of iNaturalist, but these are the specific observations for our specific project. And so what you can see here is we can look at what we've got so far. We have 134 observations have been added to this project, and those make up 89 species. So that's pretty good. And those observations have been provided by 10 people. Also on this page, it shows us who's got the most observations, who's seen the most species, and what the most observed species are. So here we can see that yellow-fronted bumblebee is so far winning. We've had 6 different observations of yellow-fronted bumblebee. So it's been a good year for bumblebees. A European paper wasp has also been common. Black-tailed bumblebee, western honeybee, and also the western polished lady beetle. So those are the most common. We scroll down here, there is a map. And so this map shows our project area. So we're interested in observations from specifically Vancouver Island. And each of these markers indicates one observation. I'm just checking the chat to make sure there's nothing in there that I should be missing. All right. So these are the observations. You can see that they're somewhat concentrated in Victoria area and up in the Comox Valley, which is where I am, and somebody in Nanaimo. So I am really hoping that the people on this call and that are joining our project are going to help us to color in the rest of the island. I want to know what's everywhere, not just in my backyard. Another part of the project, you can see we've got 26 different members. So you can see who else has joined. And then there's a project list here. So I'll just click over. So this is the project list. And so what I'm putting on the list is as these observations come in that people are going out and making in their farms, in their gardens, of these agriculturally important species, I'm going through, and this is a list of the pollinators and the beneficial insects. So I'm pulling those ones out and putting them in here so you can look and see, what have we all seen? What sort of pollinators and beneficial insects? And so we've got a whole bunch of interesting wasps, bees, a lot of species of bumblebees. Here's the honeybee. Here's a green metallic sweat bee. Here's a wool carder bee. Here's our European paper wasp, hornets. We've got some beetles. Here's a ground beetle, a couple other ground beetles. These are important predators. Lady beetles. So we've got a lot of different lady beetle species here. And then here's some hoverflies. And these are also important. The adults are pollinators and the larvae are aphid feeders. Oh, and here's a tachinid fly. And these are often parasitoids. And so that's what's on the list so far. And I'm gonna keep adding to it as we continue to bring in observations. So I'm hoping at the end of the year, we'll have a really good list of what are the beneficial species that are showing up in Vancouver Island agriculture. If we go back up here, so if you join the project and you want to come in and say, okay, so those are the beneficial ones, what about everything else? So you can click here and it will show you all of the observations that have come up in our project so far. Just give it a second to load. And so again, we've got a map view you can see here. And you can also make it into a list if you would rather see it in a list view. And you can search. So if you wanted to search for, say, lady beetles, you'd say here, this group, lady beetles. Let's see what our project found for lady beetles. And it would show you 10 observations of lady beetles and 7 different species. And so you could sit down here and you could look at all of the different observations. And if you wanted to look at any of the observations in more detail, you can click on them. And so this is where iNaturalist starts to get really interesting. So here is an example of an observation that was made and added to our project. So we have a photo. We have when it was observed, May 13th, 2021. And we have the location, it was here in Victoria. So with those 3 pieces of data, we can start looking and saying, how are things changing geographically? You know, are we finding different things in the south part of the island than in the north part of the island? We can say, how are things changing over time? When does this species tend to show up, and does that change from year to year? We can also, and this is really important, and this is part of why I think that this program is really great for farmers.
iNaturalist is a social network where anyone can record and share their photographs of living things. When you share a photograph on iNaturalist, it becomes more than just a picture.
Okay, sorry. My iNaturalist video was playing again. All right, so in this case, the person who made this observation puts it up there and he puts what he thinks it is. And Bob obviously knows what it is because he suggested that it is the Western polished lady beetle. But one of the great things about iNaturalist is that you don't actually have to know what you're looking at. So you could put it up and you could put insect or lady beetle as your suggested ID. And other members of the iNaturalist community are going to come along behind you and they're going to put their suggestions for what they think this species is. And as more people add their suggestions for what it is, iNaturalist will come to a consensus. And you can see it's done that here. It said, yeah, 3 different people have all said this is Western polished lady beetle. No one has said it's anything else. So iNaturalist said, yes, this is Western polished lady beetle. So that's great. So you don't have to know what you're looking at. You can let other people help you to figure that out. And then the extra part of adding things to our project is that you can see here the project this has been added to. So this observation has been added to VI pest, pollinator, and beneficial insects. And when it's added, there are these observation fields that you're going to fill in. And this is where we learn more about what kind of agriculture you found this insect in. So it's filled in farm type is organic, the crop type, this was on the farm margin. So this wasn't a crop, but it was near a farm. And the observation location was a garden. So we know this was quite a small scale farm, just a home garden. But with those details added, we're going to be able to look and say, what sort of agriculture do these different beneficial insects show up in? And if we wanted to know even more about this specific species, we could click on it and we'll get to go to the species page for this species. So here we are, this is the page for Western polished lady beetle. And so this has information about all of the observations of Western polished lady beetle that have been made on iNaturalist. So a whole bunch of photos, and including, if you look here, we have a photo of a larval Western polished lady beetle. So this is a baby lady beetle. It looks totally different than the adult. But now, if you're seeing the adults, you can know to keep an eye out for this one as well, the larva. Here, we've got a graph that's showing us when this species was all observed. So we can look and we can see that the majority of the observation of this species happened in May. And that's something that we can look at year to year to year and see if it changes. You can also, there's the Wikipedia article on this species if you wanted to learn some more about it. There's a map that shows where all the observations of Western polished lady beetle that have shown up on iNaturalist are. So you can get a lot of information about this species. So if you found this in your garden or your farm, you can put it up here and you can get all of this different information about it. So I'm going to show you back to the project. And I'm just going to show you how to add an observation. So the little video that I showed you how to add observations from your cell phone. So you can do that if you're out and you take a photo and it's automatically going to be geotagged with your location and your date, and you can just sort of add it right away. But if you want to go out and take photos just with your camera and then upload them, you can do it here. So it's quite simple. We go add observations. And we have the option to select a photo. So I'm going to browse to the photo that I want. This is the one. It's a photo of a bald-faced hornet that I saw. you have to put in where you were when you made the observation, because that's a really important piece of information. So I'll put in my address and search. And there it is, there's me. And if this is wrong, I can move this pin and put it in a different spot. I have to say when I saw it. So I made this observation on June 1st. And the time is not particularly important. And then what did I see? So again, let's say I didn't know what I saw. I just know that it was an insect. So as I start typing that in, it'll bring stuff up. So I'm just going to put this as insect. I'm pretty sure it was an insect. I don't need to know anything more than that. If I don't want people to know what my location was, I can change my geoprivacy here to obscured, and that will just move the pin so it isn't right on my location. And then this is an important part of adding it to this project, is filling in the project observation fields. So we have here observation location. And so here's our different scales. So I saw this one on a hobby farm. Crop type. So this was in my berry patch. I've got a number of other crop types here. So you can put in whatever most closely matches. Farm type. We're organic, but we're not certified organic. And then notes. And this is a spot for you to put in a little bit more information about what you're seeing or where you're seeing it. So we're really interested to find out more specifically about what you're seeing. And in this case, I'm going to put in, I saw this observation was in raspberry. So I'm going to add that. And then I'm going to save my observation. And it's thinking for a second. And here it is. So here's my photo on my raspberry flower that I saw. There's the pin. That's where I saw it. That's when I observed it. If I want to, I can add more photos. You can see here that it's been added to this project and that I filled in these observation fields that are giving us a little bit more information about exactly what's happening. And then here, me or anyone else in the iNaturalist community can come in and suggest an identification. And if I want, or make a comment, you want to just say something about it. And if I go here to suggest an identification, it'll come up with some suggestions for me. So it's looked at the photo and it says, oh, we're pretty sure it's this. So again here, if you're not sure what you're seeing, this is a good way to get a start of a bit of a suggestion. So I'm going to select that one and done. So that is more or less how we add the observations. And then it's added to our project. And we've got another data point for another agriculturally important species that is present here.